Hi again, and welcome to NCCP Anywhere for this second weekend of July 2022. Wherever you are in God's glorious creation, welcome, and thanks for sharing in worship with us online this week. I'm Dave Staywick, visiting homilist, and I join you as usual from our home on Capitol Hill. Today, I am with you from the sort of ceremonial, patriotic corner of my study that you've seen before. My old glory here, a flag that was actually flown over the Capitol building on behalf of my former boss, the late Senator Richard Lugar. So that's very important to me for many reasons. And I'm here in this setting today, this week, in honor of our great national holiday that we celebrated in the past week, Independence Day. So we're noting that after the fact this time. So this week, as we're together here for the next few minutes, we'll touch on our nation's birthday and a famous figure from its recent history later, in addition to our scripture reading and our very interesting series here for the summer, which we continue this week, the series called Wanna Get Away, which is a takeoff, if you'll pardon the pun, I'm sorry, on an ad campaign done a few years ago by Southwest Airlines, you may remember. It was pre-pandemic, but I still see versions of it every once in a while. Usually they were people in very embarrassing situations who sort of wanted to disappear into the woodwork, and the tagline was "Want to get away." Well, it was a very effective, a very funny campaign, and so we were appropriating that here this month. Last week, Pastor John got us going here on NCCP Anywhere when he said that after his school year of teaching and coaching, and then starting our camps at NCCP, first it was at Camp Harmison and then our commuter camps, he was ready to get away and unwind a little bit. We had on campus, we had STEM camp the first week. We had then sports camps last week, and then next week is agri-science. And I know they have a really good curriculum for that. So, and then in the midst of all that, Pastor John, not only is he kind of helping to administer our camps, but I saw last week, he checked in with me, and he was also helping out at basketball camp at the high school where he teaches and coaches DeLone Catholic up in Pennsylvania. So he wants to get away. He'll be able to do so soon enough. What we're doing this month is, as you may be well aware, is that we are considering travel narratives in the Bible. Actually, all of them are from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. We started last week with the general search for wisdom and differentiating it from simply knowledge or even understanding. So it was sort of conceptual. And now, starting today and in the next few weeks, we're going to get into concrete details of actual characters who are very interesting, some of whom we know very well, some of whom we don't. We're going to hear the stories of Ruth and Moses and Deborah, and we start today with the great story of Joseph. Joseph, he was a fellow who had some great visions of what he might become, and started by wanting to travel to check out his father's flocks, but he wound up making a detour of several years that he did not intend to make, going to a place he did not want to go. But his story is remarkable for how, amid adversity, Joseph was able to persevere and even thrive because of the continuous presence and protection of God. That's what all these characters give us examples of. That's what we want to ponder and share and celebrate ourselves as we do our little summer traveling. Some of us may take big trips, maybe some of us just small ones, but wherever we go for however long, God is with us, and that's what we're stressing this month, okay? Now, Joseph's story is, as I say, an involved one. Many of you are familiar with it, and we'll only scratch the surface of it. Our biblical excerpt, to kind of dip our toe into the water on, tells us kind of how the drama started. with his jealous brothers on that trip to scout out the flocks. It's from the 37th chapter of the book of Genesis. And it is written, when Joseph reached his brothers, they stripped off Joseph's long robe. They took him and threw him into the cistern, an empty cistern with no water in it. When they sat down to eat, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with camels carrying sweet resin, medicinal resin, and fragrant resin on their way down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what do we gain if we kill our brother and hide his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let's not harm him because he's our brother, he's family. Well, his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph up out of the cistern. They sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and found that Joseph wasn't in it, he tore his clothes. Then he returned to his brothers and said, the boy's gone, and where can I go to now? His brothers took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a male goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the long robe, brought it to their father, and said, we found this. See if it's your son's robe or not. He recognized it and said, it's my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph must have been torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put a simple mourning cloth around his waist, and mourned for his son for many days. All of his sons and daughters got up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, telling them, I'll go to my grave mourning for my son. And Joseph's father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold Joseph to the Egyptians, to Potiphar, Pharaoh's chief officer, the commander of the royal guard. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Our series is about journeys and traveling, and we've got a lot of ground to cover, but I wanted to start very quickly with a greeting to you from here in the nation's capital this past week on July 4th, since we're talking about Independence Day, and of course the iconic fireworks display on the mall west of the Capitol building. This is an image that Susan took down on the mall where she was with some members of her family who were visiting. And so she shares it as her Independence Day greeting to you, to the people of NCCP. So indeed, happy birthday to us all. Our text for today is just a snippet of the story of Joseph, one of the most memorable figures from the Hebrew Bible. When we here at NCCP share biblical passages that are familiar, Pastor Melissa is very good about warning us when we meet as preachers to discuss the text. She likes to warn us that we shouldn't assume that everybody in the pews or online are conversant with the stories that we, the preachers, may well know from our experience, our time in seminary, or our other times preaching, or in the study that we've made of them for the given week. And so that's usually good advice. But I got to say, Joseph is a little bit of a different case. He is an old friend to many of us. And I got an idea of that last week when Susan asked me what I was preaching about this week. And I said the story of Joseph. And then she kind of launched into a very detailed recitation of some of the basics of the story that she remembered. Now, she's no biblical scholar, but she knows Joseph's tale quite well, probably dating back to her childhood. And that's probably a big part of it. Joseph is a very beloved character for kids, I find. His story works well at our camp as well. So with apologies to Melissa, this week, I think we can take some liberties with this story of Joseph, and Joseph being this familiar figure. As I mentioned earlier, the story of Joseph is long and very textured, but it can be boiled down to some essential points. And I wanted to do that by making some notes and boiling it down. But I actually found myself in my work meandering quite a bit and actually taking longer than I wanted to. So I took a breath and I stepped back and I said, I want to look at somebody else's distillation of this tale. And so I went actually to a secular source, Encyclopedia Britannica, and it has a very good synopsis of the Joseph story. Here's what they say. Joseph in the Old Testament, son of the patriarch Jacob and his wife Rachel. As Jacob's name became synonymous with all of Israel, so that of Joseph was eventually equated with all the tribes that made up the northern kingdom. Joseph, most beloved of Jacob's sons, is hated by his envious brothers. Angry and jealous of Jacob's gift to Joseph, a resplendent coat of many colors, right, that we all know. That's, again, part of what cements a story with kids. Dolly Parton sang about it. The coat of many colors. The brothers seize him and sell him to a party of Ishmaelites or Midianites who carry him, Joseph, to Egypt. There, Joseph eventually gains the favor of the Pharaoh of Egypt by his interpretation of a dream and obtains a high place in Pharaoh's kingdom. His acquisition of grain supplies enables Egypt to withstand a famine. Driven by the same famine, his brothers journey from Canaan to Egypt to obtain food. They prostrate themselves before Joseph, but do not recognize him. After Joseph achieves a reconciliation with his brothers, he invites Jacob's whole household to come to Goshen in Egypt, where a settlement is provided for the family and their flocks. His brothers' sale of Joseph into slavery thus proves providential in the end, since it protected the family from famine. The family's descendants grew and multiplied into the Hebrew people, who would eventually depart from Egypt for Israel. In other words, still more travel. So there's the synopsis of the Joseph story. So Joseph, sold into slavery and being at the lowest rung of the societal ladder, worked his way up, showed his talents, entered into a place of prominence and influence, and that served many people, not only the king, as it were, but also the residents of Egypt. Despite being deserted by his envious brothers, he was never deserted by God. And let me say that again about Joseph. Despite being deserted and sold by his envious brothers, he was never deserted by God. God was with Joseph through his travels, just as God is with us today in ours. I want to mention the story of Joseph's reconciliation with his brothers very specifically. It's later in Genesis in chapter 45. Our reading was from chapter 37. It is such a glorious and a poignant part of the story. I mean, this is the word poignant, absolutely encapsulated. It's written in chapter 45. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers weren't able to answer him. They were too afraid of him. Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." Now you can almost imagine this as like being a scene from The Godfather. I thought of that with James Caan having died this past week. Joseph saying, "Come close to me." So they did. And he said, "I am your brother Joseph. I'm the one you sold into Egypt. But don't be upset. And don't be angry with yourselves because you sold me there. God sent me ahead of you to save many lives. For 2 years now, there hasn't been enough food in the land. And for the next 5 years, people won't be plowing or gathering crops. But God sent me ahead of you to keep some of you alive on earth. He sent me here to save your lives by an act of mighty power. Then Joseph threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. Benjamin also hugged him and wept. Joseph kissed all his brothers and wept over them. And I'm almost weeping now myself. So here is the really majestic element of the story of Joseph. God's protection did not only extend to Joseph in his travels, in his enslavement. God's protection extended to his brothers. That is a story of grace, pure and simple and unalloyed. They didn't deserve the forgiveness of Joseph, but he gave it to them, unmerited favor. Joseph kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Lord, have mercy. I promised you another story today in the line of the Independence Day tradition that we've developed here at NCCP's South Annex over the past few years. We've shared in recent years stories of American military and political figures who came from humble traditions to serve our country, and in so doing, were reminiscent of biblical figures. We talked about General Dwight Eisenhower and Admiral Chester Nimitz and General C.Q. Brown and General Colin Powell just last year. And this year, we're going to go a little farther down in the officer ranks to another distinguished American soldier and later politician, and someone who I happened to know, who died last December. His story is a little like Joseph's, a young man who got sent on a journey, had a major setback, and by the perseverance of his will and by God's grace, came back to make a major mark on this country. Second Lieutenant Bob Dole was born in Russell, Kansas, and attended Kansas University and the University of Arizona. Before he graduated, he joined the Army during World War II, and in 1945, Uncle Sam gave him an all-expenses-paid trip to the Apennine Mountains of Italy as a member of the 10th Mountain Division, but it was no ski trip. There he was severely wounded by German shelling, and his compatriots took care of him, but they thought he would die. His right arm was shattered. He was given morphine, but the medics couldn't do anything else in the field. Somehow, Bob Dole survived that trauma and was brought back to the States and was treated in hospitals. He was encouraged in those hospitals to see an orthopedist in Chicago named Hampar Kellican, an orthopedist who was from Chicago, who had been working with veterans returning from war. Although in their first meeting, Dr. Kellican told that Dole he would never be able to recover fully, the encounter changed Dole's outlook on life. Dole wrote that the doctor inspired me to focus on what I had left and what I could do with it, rather than complaining about what had been lost. Dr. K, as Dole later came to affectionately call him, operated on Dole 7 times, free of charge, and had, in Dole's words, an impact on my life second only to my family. Dr. K got Bob Dole out of that cistern he had been thrown into, figuratively, in medical terms. Dole recovered the mobility that he could, and it wasn't very much. He kept his arm, although it was usually cocked slightly, it was bent. He couldn't use his hand, and so he always afterwards held a pen in his hand, sort of like this. It was so that people would avoid trying to shake hands with him. And when they did, he would very quickly intercept them with his other hand and shake their hands backhand with his left hand. Well, he finished undergraduate school, then law school. He was elected a prosecutor in Kansas, a member of the Kansas State Legislature, the U.S. House of Representatives, and the United States House. And you know the rest of the Bob Dole story. He became both minority and majority leader of the Senate and was the Republican nominee for vice president in 1976 and for president in 1996. Now, I know that Bob Dole was seen as a partisan figure by some, and he was a very proud conservative, and he was a leader. But he was much more than that. He worked across the aisle on food stamp reform, on Social Security solvency, and world food relief. He supported the Equal Rights Amendment and the Americans with Disabilities Act. In his later years, he was the leading advocate for the World War II Memorial on the National Mall and was often seen down there welcoming veterans from that greatest generation that he was a part of. Now, I had the very good fortune to be around Senator Dole countless times as a news reporter, as a lobbyist, and as a Senate staff member. He was impressive. He was a big, tall man. He was boundlessly energetic and charismatic. He was charming, and he was probably the most humorous public figure I have ever been around. He was a funny guy with a very quick wit. It made me smile hundreds of times. And whenever I think of him now, I smile again. I'm saying, we gotta go back, talk about Russell, Kansas. Bob Dole's story was uniquely and distinctly American and was forever rooted in his hometown of Russell, Kansas. There he grew up and was formed. There he returned to recover from his grave wounds. There the people of Russell contributed to pay for his incidental medical expenses, and they covered them all. They were the angels who supported him in the gravest times. An American story, yes, but also a story of the grace of God through the angels who never let him down. Bob Dole and Joseph, men who went on journeys of trial and tribulation, but people who were never abandoned by God and who went on to do great things for many people, countless people. Their perseverance and achievements are inspirations for us as we go on our journeys today. I do declare and affirm that the good and gracious God who always attended them will also be with us this summer as we travel forward on our paths. And for that, we say thanks be to God. Amen.